The wind that scoured the main street of Ash Bluff, Colorado, in the dry season of 1878 had a particular malice to it. It was not a grand, roaring gale, but a persistent, whining force that carried the grit of the San Juan foothills in its teeth. It worked its way through the chinks in window frames, under the doors of the saloon, and down the collars of any soul unfortunate enough to be out in its path. Dust, fine as flour, settled over everything, a pale shroud on barrels and boardwalks alike. The air tasted of rock and distance. From the window of the stagecoach, Eliza Hart watched the town resolve itself from a smudge on the horizon into a collection of weary, unpainted buildings. Each gust of wind rocked the coach on its leather straps, a final, weary protest after a journey that had rattled the very bones in her body. She clutched the handle of her worn leather trunk with one hand and, in the pocket of her traveling coat, a folded letter with the other. The paper was soft from countless readings, its creases as familiar as the lines on her own palm. When the coach finally groaned to a halt in front of the livery, the driver, a man whose face was a road map of sun and hardship, grunted. He said she had arrived at Ash Bluff. He did not say welcome. Eliza stepped down onto the hard-packed earth, her boots sinking slightly in the accumulated dust. She pulled her shawl tighter, a useless gesture against the penetrating chill. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the street. Faces appeared in windows. Men paused on the boardwalk, their conversations dropping to a low murmur. She felt their gazes like a physical touch, a mixture of raw curiosity and a certain weary suspicion reserved for newcomers, especially a woman alone. She was a mail-order bride, a creature of rumor and speculation before she had even spoken a word. They would see her as a gamble, a piece of freight ordered from a catalog, an answer to some lonely man's advertisement. Let them look. She had been looked at her entire life, but for different reasons. She straightened her spine. The name she gave to the station master when he inquired was Eliza Hart. The name felt new in her mouth, clean and sharp, a tool she had chosen for herself. It was not the name she was born with, the name that carried the weight of textile mills and stockholder meetings, of fortunes made and lost on the whispers of men in smoke-filled rooms. That name belonged to a world of polite deceptions and gilded cages she had fled. She had watched men who spoke of honor and legacy gut her father's business with sly legal maneuvers, their smiles never faltering. She had chosen freedom over status, the raw and uncertainty of the West over the slow suffocation of the East. In the false bottom of her trunk, bearer's bonds amounting to a small fortune lay wrapped in oilcloth, a secret anchor in this new, unpredictable sea. She asked for the location of the Miles Carver homestead. The liveryman pointed a thumb toward the edge of town, his expression a mixture of pity and something else, something she could not quite name. He told her to follow the north road about a mile. "You cannot miss it," he added, his voice low. The walk was longer than a mile, or perhaps the wind made it seem so. It pushed against her, trying to turn her back toward the dubious comfort of the town. With every step, the scent of pine and cold stone was tainted by another smell, sharp and bitter, the smell of char. The road crested a small rise, and there it was, or what was left of it. The letter in her pocket had spoken of a sturdy house of spruce and a barn filled with hay, of a future built on solid ground. Before her stood only a blackened skeleton against the gray sky. Stone foundations, dark with soot, outlined the shape of a home. A few charred posts pointed upward like accusing fingers. The barn was a heap of smoldering timbers. The air was thick with the ghost of a great fire, a cold ruin that offered no warmth at all. Eliza stood motionless, the wind whipping strands of her brown hair across her face. This was not in the plan. Hardship, yes, loneliness, certainly, but not this. Not utter annihilation. Her entire imagined future had been built upon this plot of land, with a man she had never met. Now, the man and the foundation were gone, erased. She walked slowly into the field of ash, her boots crunching on the brittle remains of a life. A twisted piece of metal lay half buried in the soot. She nudged it with her toe. It was a horseshoe, cracked clean through the middle, hanging precariously from a nail on what was once a gate post. The old luck had run out. A horseman approached, his silhouette dark against the pale sky. As he drew closer, she saw he was a man of some means, his coat well made, his boots polished despite the dust. He dismounted with a practiced ease, his eyes not on her, but on the land, his gaze sweeping over the ruin with a cold, appraising light. He introduced himself as Silas Drake. He said he was the town banker. His voice was smooth, oiled, but his eyes were sharp and quick, like those of a bird of prey. They moved over the charred timbers, the stone foundation, the expanse of the property, not with sympathy, but with calculation. He was not seeing a tragedy. He was seeing an opportunity. He was counting the value of the acreage, the worth of the timber rights, the potential profit that lay beneath the cinders. He offered his condolences for her loss. He spoke of Miles Carver as a good man who had met a terrible end. He explained, with a tone of regretful necessity, that with Mr. Carver gone and the property taxes unpaid, the land would have to be put up for a tax auction by the county, a formality. He assured her he could, of course, help her navigate the process, perhaps extend a loan. For a woman in her position, his offer hung in the air, slick and cloying. Eliza felt a familiar chill, one that had nothing to do with the wind. It was the same veiled greed she had seen in the eyes of the stockholders back east. She thanked him for his information, but declined his offer. She told him she would handle her own affairs. The briefest flicker of annoyance crossed his face before it was replaced again by the mask of polite concern. He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving her alone in the quiet devastation. She turned her attention back to the ruin, her mind racing. The desire to simply get back on the next stagecoach and leave this cursed place was a physical pull, a siren song of surrender. But where would she go back to the east, to the family who thought her a fool for leaving no, that life was a cage, and she had already escaped it. She wanted something that was hers, built not on a name or a marriage contract, but on her own effort. This place, this ruin, was a blank slate, a terrible, heartbreaking one, but a blank slate nonetheless. Her gaze drifted toward the town, and she saw him for the first time. He was working outside a small workshop near the blacksmith's forge, a place that seemed to be a carpentry shop. He was planning a long plank of wood, his movements economical and precise. What caught her eye was not just his focus, but the way he worked. His right sleeve was pinned neatly at the elbow. He was missing an arm. A harness of leather and steel was strapped over his shoulder, a device that held the wood steady while his left hand guided the plane with a strength and surety that was mesmerizing. He worked without pause, his body a study in adaptation and quiet persistence. He did not look up, did not seem to notice the woman watching him from the hill of ash. He was simply a man doing his work, a solid point of reality in a world that had just dissolved into smoke. The town gossip would later tell her his name was Jonah Pike. They said he had been a quartermaster in the war, that he was as quiet and as straight as a pine board. He kept to himself, took the work that came his way, and built things that were meant to last. Standing there, with the smell of wet ash in her nostrils and the cold wind on her face, Eliza Hart made a decision. The letter in her pocket was now just a piece of paper, its promises turned to smoke. The life she had traveled 2,000 miles for was gone before it had even begun. But the land was still here. The stone foundations were still solid. She had her own name, her own 2 hands, and a secret that gave her a fighting chance. She would not be a mail-order bride who found only ashes. She would be a woman who built something from them. This place would not be the end of her journey. It would be the beginning. The first official stop Eliza made in Ash Bluff was the sheriff's office, a small, square building that smelled of stale coffee and damp wool. Sheriff Miller was a man whose body seemed to have settled into a permanent state of weariness. His face was kind, but his eyes held the long, tired look of someone who had seen too many troubles and had too few solutions. He listened to her story patiently, his gaze fixed on the cracked horseshoe she had placed on his desk. When she finished, he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the soles of his boots. He confirmed what Silas Drake had hinted at. Miles Carver was gone, vanished in the inferno. There was nothing left to bury, nothing to mark his passing save for the scorched earth where his house had stood. The sheriff's best guess was that an overturned lantern and a gust of that devil wind had conspired to take everything. As for the land, the sheriff explained with a heavy finality, it was now a matter for the county treasury. The property taxes were overdue. In 60 days, the Carver homestead would be sold at public auction to the highest bidder. His words were a final shovel of dirt on the coffin of her hopes. 60 days. A clock had started ticking. He looked at her with genuine pity. He said, "There is a stage heading east on Thursday. It is probably for the best." Eliza met his gaze, the gray of her eyes darkening like a gathering storm. She told him, her voice quiet but as firm as the granite of the mountains, that she would not be on that stage. She had come to Ash Bluff for a home, and she still intended to have one. She would be at that auction, and she would be the highest bidder. The sheriff stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, a flicker of something, perhaps admiration or maybe just disbelief, crossed his features. He said, "That is a bold plan, miss, a very bold plan." But he did not try to dissuade her further. Word of the mail-order bride's declaration traveled through Ash Bluff faster than a grass fire. When she walked into the general store to purchase a sack of flour and a side of bacon, conversation stopped. The air grew thick with unspoken judgments. A rancher, leaning against the counter, finally gave voice to the town's collective skepticism. He looked her up and down, a smirk playing on his lips. He said, "So the little lady from back east aims to buy the Carver place." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. He asked what a bride plans to do with a burned-out claim. "Do you even know which end of a hammer to hold?" The men in the store laughed. Eliza's face burned, but she did not look away. She paid the storekeeper, her movements deliberate. She picked up her supplies and turned to the rancher. Her voice was level. She said, "No, but I'm a fast learner." She left the store with her head held high, the sound of their laughter following her out into the wind. It was the laughter of men who saw the world in simple terms, men built, women kept. She was a disruption to that order, an anomaly they could not comprehend. Their scorn, however, did not weaken her resolve. It hardened it, tempering it like steel in a forge. Her next stop was the carpentry shop. Jonah Pike was there, sharpening a saw blade with long, rhythmic strokes of a file. The sound was sharp and clean against the constant moan of the wind. He did not stop when she approached, but his eyes, a surprisingly light shade of blue, flicked up to meet hers. He had a still, watchful quality about him, the patience of a man who worked with the unyielding truths of wood and steel. Eliza did not waste time with pleasantries. She told him her name was Eliza Hart and that she owned, or intended to own, the Carver property. She needed an expert opinion. She wanted to hire him to survey the damage, to tell her if there was anything worth salvaging. He finished his stroke with the file, setting it down carefully on his workbench. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady. He seemed to be measuring her, not her appearance, but her substance. Finally, he gave a single, curt nod. He told her his rate was $1 a day, plus materials. He would meet her at the site in an hour. True to his word, he arrived an hour later, his leather tool belt slung over his good shoulder. He moved through the wreckage with a slow, methodical grace, his boots leaving clean prints in the gray ash. He did not speak for a long time. He ran his hand over the stone foundation, tapping it with a small mallet, listening to the sound it made. He peered down the stone-lined well, dropping a pebble and counting the seconds until it hit water. He sifted through the charred remains of the support beams, crumbling the blackened wood between his fingers. Eliza watched him, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Her entire future rested on his assessment. If the foundation was cracked, if the well was fouled, her plan was impossible. The wind whipped at them, carrying the scent of ruin. Yet, amidst the desolation, she saw tiny green shoots pushing their way up through the ash, the leaves of wild beans, resilient and determined. The wind, as it swept through the skeletal remains of the pine trees on the ridge, made a sound like a low note being plucked on a giant guitar string. Finally, Jonah straightened up. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He said the fire burned hot and fast. The house is a total loss, but the foundation is solid, good stone, well laid. The well is deep and clean. You can rebuild here. It would take a lot of spruce, and more work than one man can rightly handle. Eliza felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She asked him if he would take the job. She had the funds to pay him. She wanted him to lead the construction. He looked from her to the empty frame of the sky where a roof should have been. He looked down at his own empty sleeve, then back at her. He said, "I build a house with one hand. Miss." Eliza met his gaze without flinching. "Then I will learn to build it with two." A silent understanding passed between them. It was not a promise of friendship, not yet, but a pact of mutual purpose. He nodded once more. He told her to meet him at the lumberyard in the morning. As she walked back to town, a new energy coursing through her veins. She was intercepted by Silas Drake. He had the uncanny ability of appearing whenever a decision was at a turning point. He tipped his hat, his smile as smooth and polished as a river stone. He said he heard of her ambitious plans. He commended her spirit but cautioned her against haste. The legalities of a tax auction could be treacherous, he warned. So many forms, so many deadlines. It would be a shame for her to lose her claim over a misplaced signature. He once again offered his assistance, a generous loan to cover the purchase price and the cost of materials. The interest rate he quoted was so high, it was practically theft. He even suggested, for her own protection, that the deed be put in his name temporarily. He would act as her trustee. He said to ensure everything was handled properly and safely. The offer was wrapped in the language of concern, but Eliza saw it for what it was, an attempt to ensnare her, to make her dependent on his power. She had not come all this way to trade one cage for another. She refused him again, more firmly this time. His smile tightened at the edges. He warned her that making enemies in a town like Ash Bluff was unwise. He turned and walked away, his posture stiff with disapproval. That night, Eliza rented a small, unused storage room at the back of the livery stable for a few dollars a week. It was little more than a stall, with rough-hewn walls and a dirt floor, but it had a roof that did not leak and a door that could be barred. She swept it clean, spread her bedroll in a corner, and sat on her trunk, eating a piece of dry bread. The wind rattled the loose boards of the wall. It was a far cry from the life she had known, but it was hers. It was a beginning. The next day, she went to the post office. It was a small, tidy establishment run by a young woman named Nell, whose bright, intelligent eyes missed nothing. Eliza wrote out a message on a telegraph form, a series of seemingly random words and numbers. It was a code she had established with her family's lawyer in Philadelphia, a man of quiet integrity who had disapproved of the way her father's partners had behaved. The message was simple. The plan had changed. Liquidate a portion of the assets. Send certificates of deposit to a general delivery box at the Ash Bluff post office under the name E. Hart. Nell took the form, her fingers tapping out the coded message with practiced speed. She slid a receipt across the counter to Eliza, a small, conspiratorial smile on her face. She said, "Whatever you are up to, miss, I hope you succeed." That afternoon, armed with a new hammer and a box of nails, Eliza returned to her land. She could not wait for Jonah. She felt a desperate need to do something, to make a mark, to begin the act of creation. She found a loose plank from the barn that was only partially burned and decided to nail it across a broken section of the corral fence. She held the nail with her left hand and swung the hammer with her right. She missed. The hammerhead struck her thumb with a jolt of white-hot pain. She cried out, dropping the hammer and cradling her throbbing hand. Tears of frustration and pain welled in her eyes. The rancher's mocking voice echoed in her head. A quiet voice behind her said, "You are holding it wrong." She spun around. Jonah Pike stood there, a small bundle of canvas under his arm. He had approached so silently she had not heard him. He gestured with his chin toward the hammer lying in the dirt. He said, "The head of the hammer is over there. You are currently threatening the wind." He was not smiling, but there was a faint glimmer of something in his blue eyes. Despite the pain in her thumb, a laugh escaped her lips. It was a raw, unpracticed sound, but it was genuine. The first time she had laughed since setting foot in Ash Bluff. The sound seemed to startle them both. The tension of the last few days broke, just for a moment, and in its place was a shared, simple reality. A woman, a one-armed carpenter, and a whole lot of work to be done. He was right. She had been threatening the wind, but now she was ready to build a wall against it. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of labor, a steady beat set by the fall of Jonah's hammer and the scrape of Eliza's shovel. They started before the sun crested the mountains, when the air was sharp and cold enough to see their breath. Their first task was always clearing, sorting the usable from the ruined. Eliza hauled stones from the collapsed chimney, her hands quickly growing raw despite the chill. They stacked the good, square-cut granite to one side, a growing testament to what could be salvaged. Jonah worked with a focused intensity that left little room for wasted motion. His custom-made harness was a marvel of practical design. A wide leather strap crossed his chest from his left shoulder, ending in a steel clamp that could be tightened with a foot pedal. He would lock a heavy spruce beam into this vise, holding it fast at waist height, leaving his single, powerful hand free to wield a saw or a plane. He moved with the wood, his body a counterbalance to the tool in his hand. Watching him, Eliza understood that he had not simply lost an arm. He had reinvented the way he worked, transforming a limitation into a unique and efficient skill. He was not a disabled carpenter. He was a carpenter. Their conversations were brief, born of necessity. Pass the nails, brace this end, watch your step. Yet, within these short exchanges, a fragile connection began to form. One afternoon, as Eliza struggled to get a grip on a heavy stone, her blistered palm split open. She bit back a cry of pain, but Jonah saw. He stopped his work, walked over, and without a word, took a pair of well-worn leather work gloves from his tool belt and pushed them into her hands. They were stiff and smelled of pine resin and sweat, but they fit her well enough. She murmured her thanks, her face flushing, and he just gave a slight nod before returning to his work. The next morning, she was the first one at the site. She had built a small fire in a ring of stones and was brewing coffee in a tin pot. When Jonah arrived, she handed him a steaming mug. He took a sip, and his eyebrows shot up. He said, "This is not coffee. This is a liquid shovel." Eliza felt a small smile touch her lips. She replied that it is meant to be strong enough to raise a house beam. He took another long drink, his eyes looking over the rim of the mug toward the rising sun. He said it might just work. But as a foundation began to rise from the ashes, so too did the whispers in town. Ash Bluff was a small community, and their project was a spectacle. The source of the most pointed gossip was Marlene, the woman who owned the saloon. She was a formidable figure with hair piled high and a gaze that missed little, lounging in her establishment. She declared to anyone who would listen that a husbandless bride building on a cursed piece of land was a bad omen. She said nothing good comes from upending the natural order of things. Her words found fertile ground among the cowboys and drifters who populated her saloon. They would ride by the heart claim, slowing their horses to shout jokes. They asked Eliza if she needed a real man to swing her hammer for her. She learned to ignore them, to focus on the weight of the stone in her hands, the satisfying thud of a nail driven true. She found an unexpected way to fight back, not with anger, but with quiet purpose. She had noticed the town's children, a half-wild pack of boys and girls with too much time on their hands and too few places to go. One evening, as she was leaving the general store, she saw a group of them throwing rocks at a stray dog. On an impulse, she called out to them. She sat them down on an overturned water trough and pulled a small, cloth-bound book from her satchel. It was a copy of Treasure Island. She began to read, her voice clear and steady against the evening wind. The children, initially suspicious, were quickly captivated by the tales of pirates and hidden gold. Soon, it became a daily ritual. Every evening, a small crowd of children would be waiting for her, their faces scrubbed clean, their usual mischief forgotten. Their mothers, grateful for the hour of peace, would watch from a distance, their expressions softening from suspicion to a cautious gratitude. Silas Drake, however, was not moved by such displays of community spirit. He saw her progress not as a sign of resilience, but as a threat to his own plans. He approached her one afternoon at the site, a sheaf of official-looking documents in his hand. He explained, his voice dripping with false sympathy, that the county clerk had uncovered some unforeseen administrative costs associated with her claim. There was a new fee for processing the title application and a substantial charge for the mandatory printing of the auction notice in the regional newspaper. The total was an exorbitant sum, one he knew she would struggle to produce. He let the threat hang in the air. If the fees were not paid in full within the week, he would be forced to file a petition to have the auction date moved forward, citing her inability to meet her financial obligations. He was tightening the net, using the weight of bureaucracy as his weapon. Eliza's heart sank, but she did not let her panic show. She told him she would review the documents and be in touch with the county office. His smile was thin. He told her not to trouble herself. He said all payments must go through his bank. It is for proper accounting. Discouraged, she watched him ride away. The weight of the task ahead, of the forces allied against her, felt immense. Just then, a heavy wagon, pulled by two massive draft horses, rumbled up the road. It was Mr. O'Rourke, the town blacksmith. He was a mountain of a man with a wild red beard and arms as thick as tree limbs. He stopped his wagon beside a pile of spruce beams that she and Jonah had been struggling to move into position all morning. Without a word, he dismounted, hoisted a beam onto his shoulder as if it were a fence post, and carried it over to the foundation. He did this 3 more times, then got back on his wagon, gave Eliza a solemn wink, and rumbled away. The silent, powerful act of kindness was a balm to her frayed nerves. Later that day, when she went to the post office, Nell slid a letter across the counter to her. She leaned forward and whispered, "Do not let that snake Drake get to you. Half this town is sick of his thumb on the scales. You just keep building." The letter was not the one she was waiting for from her lawyer. It was a simple note of encouragement from one of the mothers whose children came for her evening readings. Tucked inside was a freshly baked biscuit wrapped in a napkin. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a turning point, a sign that she was not entirely alone. A few days later, a new figure arrived in Ash Bluff. He was a man named Ambrose Vale, and he stood out from the dusty prospectors and weathered ranchers like a canary in a coal mine. He wore a city suit and a derby hat, and he carried a leather-bound notebook. He introduced himself as a correspondent for a Denver newspaper, here to write a story about the resilience of frontier towns. But his eyes were too sharp, too interested in the price of land and the whispers of gossip. He spent a great deal of time in the company of Silas Drake. The two of them huddled at a corner table in the saloon. One afternoon, Vale rode out to the Hart claim. He complimented their progress, his gaze lingering on Eliza. He made an offhand remark about the unpredictable fortunes of the East. He said it is funny how a family's name can be a blessing one day and a burden the next. He mentioned a prominent textile family, the Langleys, whose patriarch had recently passed, leaving behind a swirl of rumors and a daughter who had reportedly vanished. He looked directly at Eliza as he spoke, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. Eliza's blood ran cold. He knew, or he suspected enough to be dangerous, and she knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in her gut, that he had shared his suspicions with Silas Drake. The game had just become infinitely more dangerous. Silas no longer saw her as just an obstacle to a piece of land. He now smelled a much larger fortune. That evening, after Jonah had left for the day, Eliza walked through the skeleton of her future home. The frame was up, the main beams outlining the shape of rooms against the darkening sky. She found the old homestead sign, the words Carver Homestead still faintly visible beneath a layer of soot. She picked up a sharp piece of granite and began to scrape. She worked until her fingers were numb, scraping away the ash, scraping away the name of the man she had never met, scraping away the past that was not hers. When the wood was clean, she took a piece of charcoal from the fire pit. In clear, steady letters, she wrote 2 words on the board Hart claim. It was not a request. It was a declaration. The end of the day came not with a clock's chime, but with the slow descent of the sun behind the jagged peaks of the San Juans. The light turned golden, then a deep, bruised purple, casting long shadows that stretched from the 3 completed bays of the house frame, making them look like the ribs of some great, sleeping creature. The wind, which had been a constant harasser all day, softened into a sigh, carrying the clean, sharp scent of freshly cut spruce and pine resin. Work for the day was done. The sounds of hammering and sawing gave way to a profound quiet, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the open rafters. Jonah was gathering his tools, his movements as deliberate and unhurried as always. He cleaned the sawdust from his plane, oiled the blade of his saw, and arranged each item in his leather tool roll with a practiced hand. Eliza sat on a stack of unused planks, her body aching with a satisfying weariness she was coming to know well. She watched him, the way the fading light caught the lines of concentration on his face. In the weeks they had been working, a silent language had grown between them, a communication of shared glances, anticipated needs, and mutual respect built on the foundation of common labor. From the pocket of her worn coat, she drew the letter, Miles Carver's letter. The paper was limp and fragile now, its edges softened by the touch of her fingers. In the deepening twilight, she could barely make out the hopeful, looping script that had drawn her across a continent. It spoke of a good life, a solid house, a partnership. It was a letter from a ghost, full of promises that had turned to ash. She walked to the center of the framed-out structure, the place that would one day be the main room, and hung a storm lantern from a nail Jonah had driven into a crossbeam earlier that day. She struck a match, the small flame flaring bravely in the gloom, and lit the wick. A warm, steady glow pushed back the encroaching darkness, illuminating the fresh, pale wood of the beams and casting their linked shadows on the hard-packed earth. She stood in the circle of light, the letter still in her hand, and the weight of everything. The journey, the loss, the uncertainty settled upon her. She spoke the words aloud, her voice barely more than a breath, not meant for anyone but herself and the ghosts of this place. She said, "I came here as a mail-order bride. I carried a secret fortune in my trunk, just enough to give me a fresh start, a safe landing. I thought I would find a family, a home. Instead, I found only this. I found ashes." Her voice caught on the last word. She looked down at the letter, at the dead man's promises, then up at the sturdy, honest frame of the house rising around her. She looked over at Jonah, who had paused in his work and was now watching her, his expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. Her journey had not been a straight line from hope to despair. It had taken an unexpected turn. The mail-order bride came with secret wealth and found ashes, but she had found something else in the wreckage. She had found a one-armed carpenter who was worth more. The thought was so clear, so true, that it felt as solid as the granite foundation beneath her feet. The value of this man was not something that could be counted in dollars or tallied on a ledger. It was in his quiet competence, his unwavering steadiness, the way he met the world on his own terms without complaint or compromise. It was in the gloves he had given her, the silent help from the blacksmith he had somehow arranged, the way he never once made her feel weak or incapable. Jonah finished packing his tools and walked toward her, his footsteps soft on the dusty ground. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze direct. He had clearly heard her. A faint flush crept up his neck, and he seemed at a loss for words, a rare state for a man who is usually so comfortable in his silence. He cleared his throat. He said, "I wish I was worth as much as walnut, but I am just mountain pine, good for framing, but not much for fancy cabinets." The reply was so perfectly him plain-spoken, humble, with a hint of dry wit that it broke the spell of her melancholy. A real smile touched her lips, warming her from the inside out. He was right. He was like mountain pine strong, resilient, and utterly without pretense, and that was more than enough. They stood in a comfortable silence, the lantern light creating a small, intimate world for them within the vast, dark landscape. The wind picked up again, a low moan through the open walls, but the lantern's flame barely flickered. Eliza noticed that the main strap of his complex harness was twisted where it crossed his shoulder, the leather digging into the muscle. Before she could think, she stepped forward. She reached out and laid her hand on the thick leather strap. Her fingers brushed against the rough canvas of his shirt, and she could feel the solid warmth of his body beneath. The air grew still between them. She smelled the scent of sawdust and clean sweat that clung to him, a scent she now associated with safety and progress. Her touch was gentle as she worked the twist out of the strap, her fingers moving with a slow, deliberate care. He stood perfectly still, his breath catching for a moment. The small, practical gesture became something more, an unspoken acknowledgement of the trust and care that had grown between them. The distance that had separated them, the mail-order bride and the town carpenter, had vanished. When she was done, she let her hand rest on his shoulder for a second longer than necessary before letting it drop to her side. Jonah finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. He said, "I am not good with words, Miss Hart, but I do not leave a job half finished." It was not a declaration of affection, but it was something deeper. It was a promise, a statement of character forged in iron and wood. It was his way of saying he was not going anywhere. Eliza met his gaze, her own voice steady and clear in the quiet night. She replied, "And I do not abandon the man who is building it." Their words hung in the air. A contract sealed not with ink and paper, but with shared labor and mutual respect. At that moment, a movement on the low ridge to the east caught her eye. Two figures on horseback, silhouetted against the last vestiges of daylight. Even at this distance, she recognized the straight-backed posture of Silas Drake in the citified slump of Ambrose Vale. They were watching the house, watching them. As she watched, Vale dismounted, took out his notebook, and began to write, his pen scratching away in the dying light like an insect scribbling their fate. A cold dread settled over the warmth of the moment. Their small sanctuary was being observed, measured, and plotted against. Jonah had seen them too. A muscle tightened in his jaw, but he said nothing. He reached up and adjusted the lantern, making sure it was secure on its nail. Its light glowed in the center of their unfinished home, a single, defiant star in the gathering darkness. It was a small flame against the vast, encroaching night and the watching eyes on the hill. But it was their flame. It was a promise of a roof, of walls, of a future. And for now, it was enough. The day after the watchers on the hill, Eliza felt the urgency shift. It was no longer a passive threat, but an active one. She went to the post office first, a plan solidifying in her mind. Nell was waiting. The face of the young woman was tight with a shared worry. Her usual bright expression clouded. Nell did not speak, but she slid a heavy folder across the polished wood counter. It was thick, bound with string, and sealed with dark red wax. The imprint of a Philadelphia law firm pressed firmly into it. Eliza's breath steadied. This was her paperwork. This was her anchor. The telegraph she had sent weeks ago had been answered. Inside this folder, she knew, were the legal documents from her lawyer, affidavits and bank statements confirming her independent financial standing, her severance from her family's business, and her legal right to conduct transactions under her own name. She took the folder, her hands not trembling, and did not open it. She asked Nell if the post office offered secure storage. Nell nodded, her eyes showing she understood immediately. She led Eliza to a heavy iron safe in the back room, a relic from the old mining days. Eliza placed the folder inside, unopened. It was not a weapon to be flaunted. It was a defense, to be held in reserve. She trusted Nell. The postmistress was one of the few who saw the mechanisms of the town clearly, and she held a deep, quiet disdain for Silas Drake. Eliza returned to the claim, her mind clearer. Jonah was already there, sighting down a long, perfect beam of spruce. He was using his plumb bob, a heavy brass weight on a waxed string, to find the true vertical line for the main door frame. He held the string between his thumb and forefinger, his head tilted, watching the bob sway back and forth, the arc of its movement slowly shrinking as it fought against gravity and the faint breeze. He was patient, waiting for it to find its stillness. He said a straight line just needs time to find its center. Eliza watched the brass point settle, hanging motionless, perfectly aligned with the center mark he had made on the foundation. She wished her own life, her own reputation in this town, could find its center so easily. The string of her honor was swaying wildly, and Silas Drake was the one shaking it. The attack came that afternoon. It was not a physical assault. It was worse. A notice, hammered with 4 nails to the community board outside the office of the sheriff. Silas Drake, acting as a concerned citizen and representative of the Ash Bluff Bank, had filed a formal petition with the county. The document, written in dense legal language that was designed to intimidate, called for an immediate halt to all construction on the Carver claim and a review of the upcoming auction. It cited grave concerns of a potential fraud upon the mail, suggesting the intended recipient of the property, Miles Carver, was deceased, and that an unknown party, using an assumed name, was attempting to seize the land under false pretenses. It formally requested a town hall meeting, to be held at the saloon the following week, to discuss the matter publicly. The paper was a declaration of war, and it had just been made in the open. That same evening, Ambrose Vale found Silas Drake in the livery stable. Not the saloon. The stable was private, the smell of hay and old leather a sufficient cover for their business. Vale was smoking a thin, expensive cigar, looking pleased with himself. He leaned against a stall, his city suit looking absurdly out of place. He told Silas the situation was far more promising than the banker knew. That woman, Eliza Hart, was not just some runaway with a little pin money. Vale tapped the side of his leather notebook. He had been thorough. His inquiries back east had borne fruit. Her real name was Eliza Langley. Her family, the Langleys of Philadelphia, practically owned the textile industry. They were sitting on a mountain of money. Vale explained that the Langley family had been quietly, through intermediaries, buying up mineral rights in the Northern Territories. He speculated that her presence here was not about a mail-order marriage at all. It was a spearhead. She was here to survey the land, specifically the hills north of town. hills that everyone, including Silas, had considered worthless scrub, if the Langleys were interested. That land was about to become the richest patch in the county. The eyes of Silas Drake, usually sharp and cold, widened with a new, burning avarice. He had been trying to swat a fly when he should have been setting a trap for a bear. He had been focused on a single burned-out homestead. Ambrose Vale smiled, blowing a cloud of smoke toward the dusty rafters. He said, of course, a scandal could ruin her. An unmarried woman of her high station, traveling alone under a false name, claiming poverty, living in a storage room. Her family would pay anything to avoid the embarrassment. Or perhaps they would pay Silas, a respectable local banker, to secure the land for them, cutting the troublesome daughter out of the deal entirely. The two men looked at each other. A new, more profitable partnership was formed. Silas was no longer just trying to get a small homestead. He was aiming for the entire northern range. The notice in the town square acted like a poison in the well of the town. The gossip shifted overnight, twisting into something far more malevolent. Marlene, at her saloon, now had a new story to tell, one that confirmed all her worst suspicions. That Hart woman was not just an unfortunate widow. She was a liar, a rich Eastern heiress, playing them all for fools. Why else would she refuse the generous help of Mr. Drake? Why else would she hide her name? She was pretending to be poor, laughing at their hardscrabble lives, probably trying to steal their land from under them. The sentiment spread with terrifying speed. When Eliza went to the general store for provisions, the usual neutrality of the shopkeeper was replaced with a cold correctness. The ranchers who had once tipped their hats now looked at her with open suspicion, whispering to each other as she passed. The worst blow, the one that truly struck her heart, came that evening. She walked to her usual spot by the water trough, her copy of Treasure Island in hand, ready for the children. No one was there. The small, worn patch of ground where they usually sat was empty. She stood for a long moment, the familiar ache of isolation returning, sharper and more bitter this time. One of the mothers, the very woman who had sent her a fresh biscuit, approached from across the street. Her hands were twisting in her apron, and she would not meet Eliza's eyes. She looked ashamed. She told Eliza that her husband and the other men did not want their children associating with her anymore, not with all this talk of fraud and court papers and a public meeting. She said it just did not look right. She apologized, her voice barely a whisper, and hurried away, calling her son inside. Eliza stood alone as the sun set, the book heavy in her hand. They had taken her community, the small part she had started to build. She did not sleep that night in her small, cold livery room. She paced the dirt floor, her mind racing. They had attacked her name, her purpose, and her small, fledgling relationships. She could not fight them with the truth of her money. That would only confirm their worst suspicions, that she was a deceiver. And she could not fight them with anger. She had to give them something better to believe in. The next morning, she did not go to the claim. She took a clean ledger book and a pen from her trunk. She went first to Mr. O'Rourke, the blacksmith. He was shoeing a horse, the clang of his hammer against the anvil ringing in the clear morning air. She stood patiently until he was finished. The horse led away. She explained her situation, her voice low and steady. She did not whine or complain. She told him the town meeting was meant to ruin her, to run her out. But her plan was not just to build a house for herself. It was to build a school. Ash Bluff had no school, no teacher. The children of the town, his children, deserved to know how to read and write and cipher. She was not asking for money. She was asking for his support. She opened the ledger to the first page, where she had written in her clear, strong hand, petition for the Ash Bluff School, to be housed at the Hart claim. Mr. O'Rourke looked at her, his eyes thoughtful under his bushy red brows. He looked at the ledger, then back at her face. He wiped his massive, soot-stained hand on his leather apron and took the pen from her. He signed his name, the letters huge and deliberate, taking up 3 lines. She went from there to the general store, to the mothers who had turned away, to the few ranchers who seemed more thoughtful than the saloon crowd. She did not plead. She did not defend herself against the rumors. She simply stated her purpose. She wanted to build a school. She needed their signatures to show the town council she was a benefit to the community, not a threat. It was a slow, grueling, humiliating process. Some shut the door in her face. Marlene saw her from the saloon and laughed out loud. But others, the ones who had watched her read to their children, the ones who wanted something better for the future of this dusty town, they signed. She was fighting paperwork with paperwork, rumor with a tangible promise. Late that afternoon, she was leaving the general store, the ledger heavy with 24 names, 2 cowhands, fresh from the saloon run by Marlene and full of cheap whiskey and mean-spirited importance, blocked her path on the boardwalk. They were the same men who had mocked her weeks before. One of them, a big man with a slack jaw, doffed his hat in a parody of politeness. He asked if this was the fancy lady from Philadelphia. He said he heard she was worth a fortune, and maybe she could spare some for 2 hard-working men. His companion, quicker and meaner, grabbed the ledger from her hands. He started to laugh, saying he was going to see who in town was stupid enough to sign a liar's book. Eliza grabbed for the book, her face pale but furious. She told him to give it back. The man held it high, out of her reach, laughing. He said her what, little lady? A shadow fell over them. Jonah Pike had come up behind them, moving as silently on the boardwalk as he did on the claim. He had been at the lumber yard, and his presence was sudden and absolute. He did not raise his voice. He just said, "Give the lady her book." The man with the ledger turned, a drunken smirk on his face. He looked at the empty sleeve of Jonah, pinned neatly at the elbow, and laughed. He asked what Jonah planned to do about it. Jonah did not answer with words. He moved with a speed that was shocking. His left hand shot out and gripped the wrist of the man. It was not a punch. It was a hold. The eyes of the man widened in pain as the fingers of Jonah, fingers strengthened by years of precise, one-handed labor with saws and chisels, dug into the nerves of his arm. The ledger fell to the boardwalk. The knees of the man buckled, and he let out a choked gasp. Jonah did not release him. He pulled the man closer, until their faces were inches apart. His light blue eyes were as cold and hard as winter ice. He spoke, his voice low and carrying, each word distinct. He said, "You do not put your hands on her, and you do not hammer on wood that is still being set." He shoved the man back, sending him stumbling into his companion. They scrambled to their feet, their drunken bravado evaporating, replaced by a sudden, sober fear. They backed away, then turned and hurried back toward the saloon. Jonah bent down, his body relaxing. He picked up the ledger, dusted it off with his hand, and offered it to Eliza. His face was calm, as if nothing had happened. She took it, her hands shaking. She looked from the retreating men to his steady form. He had not been violent. He had been precise. He had defended her, and her purpose, without throwing a single punch. He just nodded at the ledger in her hand. He asked if she had gotten what she needed. She looked at the names, her anchor of community support. She nodded, her voice tight. She said, almost, the town hall meeting was 3 days away. The tension in Ash Bluff was a string pulled taut, ready to snap. The plumb bob was still swaying. The attack from Silas Drake had set a deadline, but nature, in its infinite and cruel indifference, set another. The first sign was not a cloud in the sky, but a change in the light. The brilliant, high-altitude sun of Colorado grew hazy, its edges blurring as if seen through smoked glass. The wind, a constant companion, shifted its tone from a low moan to a high, nervous whine. An unnatural stillness fell over the land, the kind that precedes violence. Jonah paused, his hand resting on a half-set joist, and sniffed the air. He looked to the west, where the horizon was being erased by a wall of advancing brown. He told Eliza, his voice low and serious, to tie down anything that could fly. A duster is coming. It was an understatement. Within the hour, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of sand and fury. The sky vanished, replaced by a choking, blinding curtain of earth. The wind did not just blow, it scoured. A physical force that tore at their clothes and filled their mouths and eyes with grit. The house frame, their proud skeleton of a home, began to protest. The new spruce timbers groaned under the strain. The sound a deep, resonant cry of an organism in pain. The wind found every joint, every nail, testing their work with a relentless, shrieking pressure. They had laid a few temporary planks across the highest beams to serve as a makeshift roof and work platform. One of these, a heavy 12-foot board, was the first to surrender. With a sound like a pistol shot, the nails holding it gave way, and the plank was lifted into the swirling chaos, vanishing instantly. They had to secure the rest. There was no discussion, no plan laid out in words. They moved as one organism, their actions dictated by a shared instinct for survival and a deep familiarity with the structure they were building. Jonah, with a coil of thick rope, moved with a terrifying grace along the high beams. He looped one end of the rope around his leather shoulder harness, anchoring himself to the house itself, and used his body as a brace against the gale. He was a sailor in a storm, his ship the frame of a house on a sea of dust. Eliza became his hands on the ground. She was his anchor, feeding him rope, hauling tools up in a bucket. Her eyes squinted to slits against the stinging sand. Her world narrowed to the swaying figure above her and the task at hand. When he shouted for nails, she was there, her hand full of them, passing them up to him. Their movements found a rhythm, a desperate dance against the storm's chaotic percussion. He would brace himself, his one hand driving a nail with 3 perfect, powerful strokes, and she would be ready with the next. A fresh gust, stronger than the rest, hit the house with the force of a battering ram. The entire structure shuddered. Another loose plank, one they had not yet reached, was ripped from its temporary mooring. It did not fly away. It cartwheeled through the air, a deadly, spinning projectile, and slammed into Eliza's side, throwing her against a stack of lumber. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot through her shoulder. For a moment, the world went black. She heard Jonah shout her name, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. When her vision cleared, he was beside her, his face a mask of concern. He helped her up, his grip on her good arm steady and strong. The plank had struck her shoulder and ribs, and she knew a deep, ugly bruise was already forming. There was no time to assess the damage. He looked at her, his light eyes searching her face. He asked if she could stand. She nodded, biting her lip against the pain. He took his own scarf from his neck, a simple square of cotton, and with a few deft movements, fashioned a tight sling, binding her arm to her body to keep her shoulder still. The makeshift brace was surprisingly effective. He looked at the raging storm around them, at the straining timbers of their half-built house. A grim smile touched his lips. He leaned in close so she could hear him over the wind. He said, "When this is over, we will tell the storm it owes us a roof." The absurdity of it, the sheer, stubborn defiance in his words, broke through her pain. She laughed, a short, breathless sound that was half a sob. They stood there for a moment, 2 small figures against the immense, impersonal power of nature. And then they went back to work. The storm raged for 3 hours, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it passed. The wind dropped, leaving behind an eerie, ringing silence. The world was coated in a fine layer of brown dust, a new topsoil that covered everything. Their house frame, battered and bruised, was still standing. They had not lost a single structural beam. That night, The second attack came, as silent and deadly as the first had been loud. With the dust gone, the sky opened up into a vast, black vault filled with a spray of pitilessly bright stars. The temperature plummeted. The dry air, stripped of its insulating blanket of dust, offered no protection against the cold of the high desert night. A deep, penetrating chill settled into the land, a cold that felt like it was radiating up from the frozen ground itself. They huddled by a small, sputtering fire Eliza had managed to build in their stone ring, but it was a feeble defense. The heat rose straight up into the infinite cold of the sky, offering little warmth to their shivering bodies. Eliza's teeth chattered uncontrollably. The pain in her shoulder had dulled to a deep, throbbing ache, made worse by the cold. Jonah, usually so stoic, was hunched over the flames, his face pale in the firelight. They were in real danger of hypothermia. He looked at her, his expression grim. He said, "We need to share warmth, or we will not make it until morning." There was nothing of romance in his words, only the stark, practical truth of survival. He laid his bedroll out close to the fire, and she laid hers beside it. There was a moment of awkward hesitation. Then she lay down, her back to him. A moment later, she felt him lie down behind her, his back pressing against hers. The contact was not intimate in the way a touch or a kiss was. It was more fundamental. It was the simple, animal sharing of body heat against a killing cold. She could feel the solid line of his spine against hers, the steady, slow rhythm of his breathing. The shivering that had racked her body began to subside, replaced by a slow creeping warmth. The cold was still there, a predator circling their small island of shared life. But it was no longer inside her bones. She did not speak, and neither did he. There were no words for this strange, desperate intimacy. They simply lay there, back to back, two strangers bound by a storm and a fire, listening to the vast, cold silence of the mountains. The sun rose the next morning on a world that felt scoured clean. They were stiff and sore, but they were alive. As Eliza stretched her aching muscles, she looked over at a lone cottonwood tree that stood at the edge of the claim. The storm had ravaged it. A massive limb had been torn away, leaving a pale, jagged wound in the trunk. The tree was maimed, half of its crown gone. But as she walked closer, she saw that on the remaining branches, tiny, green buds were already pushing their way toward the new sun. The life within it was too strong to be defeated by the storm. She reached out and touched the rough, broken bark. She whispered to herself, "It is still budding." Later that morning, as they were clearing the last of the storm's debris, a wagon rumbled up the road. It was Mr. O'Rourke, and behind him were two other men, ranchers she recognized from her petition rounds. They carried hammers and saws. Mr. O'Rourke did not offer any grand speeches. He spat on his hands, rubbed them together, and looked at the house frame. He said, "It looks like you could use a few extra hands. The town meeting is in 2 days. It would be a shame if this house did not have a roof on it by then." Eliza felt a lump form in her throat. Their defiance of the storm had been witnessed. Their will had been tested in public, and they had not broken. These men were not just offering to help. They were casting a vote, not with a ballot, but with their own sweat and labor. From his office at the bank, Silas Drake saw them. He watched as O'Rourke and the others began to work alongside Jonah, the sound of 4 hammers now ringing in the clear morning air. His plan to let the wind do his dirty work had failed. The storm had not torn them down. It had made them a symbol of resilience. His face, usually a mask of calm control, twisted into a dark scowl. He knew he was losing the battle for public opinion. He needed a stronger weapon. He went to the county clerk's office, a place where he was a frequent and influential visitor. He found the clerk, a nervous little man named Peters who had a gambling debt that Silas happened to hold. Silas did not need to make threats. He simply reminded Peters of his outstanding obligation and then placed a new, freshly drafted document on his desk. It was a motion to have the Hart claim auction reviewed on the grounds of newly discovered information regarding the claimant's financial history. It was a lie, but it was a lie on official paper. Silas told Peters to make sure that document was at the top of the judge's pile when the circuit court convened next week. Meanwhile, Ambrose Vail was at the telegraph office. He was not sending a coded message. He was sending a story, in plain English, to the Denver Chronicle. His version of events was a masterpiece of insinuation and righteous indignation. It told the tale of a small, hard-working frontier town being infiltrated by a wealthy, deceptive heiress from the East, a swindling bride who was using a tragedy to manipulate the legal system for her own vast, unknown financial gain. He was taking the fight beyond the borders of Ash Bluff. He was putting Eliza Hart on trial in the court of public opinion across the entire territory. The storm of dust had passed. The storm of paper and ink was just beginning. The saloon run by Marlene was not built for civic discourse. It was a long, narrow room designed for drinking, gambling, and the forgetting of troubles, not the settling of them. Yet, on the night of the town meeting, it was packed to the rafters with the entire voting population of Ash Bluff and then some. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and unwashed bodies, all overlaid with a palpable tension that was heavier than the smoke from the oil lamps. Men lined the bar and filled the tables, their faces grim. A small, tight-lipped contingent of women, including the mothers from Eliza's reading circle, stood clustered by the door, a silent, watchful presence. Mayor Thompson, who also served as the town's barber and undertaker, stood on a makeshift platform behind the bar. He was a practical man who preferred the clean logic of a straight razor cut to the messy business of public disputes. He slammed a wooden gavel, a repurposed bung starter, on the bar. The low murmur of conversations died. He said, "This meeting is now in session. The purpose is to hear the petition brought forth by Mr. Silas Drake concerning the property known as the Carver claim. Mr. Drake, you have the floor." Silas Drake stood, the picture of civic virtue in his dark, well-tailored suit. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in the calm, reasonable tones of a man who deals only in facts and figures. He recounted the tragic story of Miles Carver's demise and the subsequent arrival of a woman, a stranger, who called herself Eliza Hart. He spoke of the need for legal propriety, for the protection of the town from outside interests and potential deception. He formally proposed that the county freeze all proceedings related to the Hart claim until a full and proper investigation into the identity and motives of Miss Hart could be conducted. When he finished, Ambrose Vail took his place. The newspaperman was a performer. He paced before the crowd, his voice rising and falling with theatrical flair. He did not speak of legal propriety. He spoke of honor. He painted a picture of a simple, trusting frontier town being duped by a sophisticated charlatan from the East. He used words like masquerade and scheme, hinting at vast, hidden fortunes and a conspiracy to defraud the good people of Ash Bluff. He spoke directly to the men in the room, his words a subtle poison, questioning their judgment, implying they were being made fools of by a lone woman. He was not presenting evidence. He was stoking resentment. When he stepped down, a low, ugly muttering filled the room. Eliza felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. She sat on a single chair placed in the center of the room, a defendant in an unofficial court. Jonah stood against the far wall, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Mr. O'Rourke and a few of the other men who had helped with the roof stood near him, a small, solid island of support. Mayor Thompson banged his gavel again. He looked at Eliza. He said, "Miss Hart, you have the right to respond." Eliza stood. She did not look at Silas Drake or Ambrose Vail. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the ranchers, the storekeeper, the women by the door. Her hands, calloused and scraped from her work, were steady at her sides. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and carried to every corner of the room. She said, "My name is Eliza Hart. I came to Ash Bluff to be the wife of Miles Carver. That was my intention. I arrived to find that the man was gone and the home he promised was a field of ash." "Everything, mister. Vale says about my past is designed to make you suspicious. The truth is much simpler. I left a life in the East that did not suit me. It was a life of great comfort, but it was not my own. I wanted to build something for myself, with my own 2 hands. I chose this place, this burned piece of land, because it was a place to start over." She paused, letting her words settle. She said, "I have never lied to any of you about my purpose here. As for my name, it is true that I was born with another. But in this country, a person has the right to choose their own name, to build their own identity. My choice was legal and proper." From her satchel, she produced a thin envelope, not the heavy, wax-sealed folder from the safe, but a smaller one. She walked to the bar and handed it to the mayor. She told him inside, "He will find a certified copy of a court order from Philadelphia, legally recognizing my change of name. He will also find a letter of credit from a reputable bank, proving I have the necessary funds to purchase the land and see to its improvement. I am not a pauper, but my wealth is not your concern. My character is, and my character is in the work I have done." She turned and walked back to her chair, her back straight, her head held high. A stunned silence fell over the room. She had not been defensive. She had been direct. She had met their accusations not with emotion, but with a simple presentation of fact and a legal document. The mayor called for Jonah Pike. Jonah did not walk to the front. He simply uncrossed his arms and spoke from where he stood against the wall. His voice was low, matter of fact, the voice of a man stating plain truths. He said, "I am not a man for speeches. I am a carpenter." He held up a small, neat ledger book. He said, "This is my account for the Hart claim. It lists every beam, every nail, every hour of labor. Miss Hart has paid me for my work, on time and in full. The money I have received from her comes from sweat, not from rumors. The house we are building is a good, strong house. It is built to stand." He closed the book. That was all. He had not defended her honor. He had simply testified to the solid reality of their shared work, a reality that was more powerful than all of Ambrose Vale's empty words. Then, a new voice spoke up. It was Nell, the postmistress. She stepped forward from the crowd of women, her face flushed but her voice steady. She said, "As the federal postmistress for this town, I can attest that Miss Hart has conducted all her business with me in an honest and forthright manner. She has sent and received mail and telegraphs, all legally and properly." She then turned her gaze on Silas Drake. Her voice gained a sharp, intelligent edge. She said, "I also handle the posting of all official county notices. I am familiar with the regulated fees for such postings. I must say, I was surprised to see the bill for the notice of this auction. The fee for printing seems to have been inflated significantly. I have a copy of the county fee schedule right here, if the mayor would like to see it." Silas Drake, who had been watching the proceedings with a smug confidence, stiffened. He shot a venomous look at the county clerk, Peters, who was lurking in the back of the room. Peters suddenly seemed fascinated by his own boots, his face pale. The crowd murmured. This was something they could understand. Not rumors of Eastern fortunes, but the simple, grubby reality of a local official overcharging for his services. A crack had appeared in the banker's respectable facade. Before Silas could respond, one of the mothers stepped forward. She said, "I do not know about any of this legal business, but I know that since Miss Hart has been here, my boys have been spending their afternoons learning to read instead of throwing rocks behind the saloon. She says she is building a school. That sounds like a good thing for this town to me." Another woman nodded in agreement. The tide of opinion in the room, which had been flowing so strongly against Eliza, was beginning to turn. Mayor Thompson banged his gavel, calling for order. He looked at the paper Eliza had given him. He looked at the ledger from Jonah. He looked at the shifting faces in the crowd. He was a practical man, and he could see this was no longer a simple matter. He made his decision. He said, based on the documents presented, "I see no legal reason to freeze Miss Hart's claim at this time. The construction can continue." However, the questions raised by Mr. Drake are serious enough to warrant a formal hearing. The circuit judge is due in Ash Bluff next week. This matter will be settled then, in a proper court of law. This meeting is adjourned. A collective sigh of relief and continued tension filled the room. It was not a complete victory, but it was not a defeat. The battle had been pushed to a new, more serious stage. As the crowd began to break up, the tension finally broke in an unexpected way. An old, leather-faced cowboy, a man who had not spoken a word all night, pushed his hat back on his head. He looked at Eliza, a grudging admiration in his watery eyes. He said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I do not know about her being a fancy lady from the East, but I have been watching her work out there, and I will tell you this. That mail-order bride drives a nail straighter than I can shoot a mosquito." A ripple of laughter, genuine and spontaneous, spread through the saloon. It was a sound of respect, of acknowledgement from a man whose world was defined by practical skill. The laughter was a release, a small victory in itself. It was the sound of a community beginning to build its own judgment, based not on rumor, but on the undeniable evidence of hard work. The temporary victory at the saloon felt thin, like a single layer of canvas against a coming blizzard. Work on the house continued, now with a new urgency. Mr. O'Rourke and his friends came when they could, and under their combined efforts, the roof began to take shape, a solid cap of spruce planks against the vast, indifferent sky. The ringing of hammers was a defiant sound, a proclamation of progress. But for Eliza, it was drowned out by the silent ticking of the clock counting down to the circuit judge's arrival. The town's mood had shifted, but it had not settled. The laughter that had broken the tension in the saloon had faded, replaced by a watchful waiting. The community was a hung jury, reserving its final judgment. The rumors Ambrose Vale had so carefully planted had not died. They had merely burrowed deeper, like seeds of distrust waiting for the right conditions to sprout. Eliza felt the weight of their uncertainty in every averted gaze, in every conversation that stopped when she drew near. She had won a skirmish, but the war for her place in this town, for the very land under her feet, would be fought in a courtroom, a place where truth was often less important than procedure and perception. Her greatest fear was not Silas Drake's legal maneuvering. It was the secret she still held, the one piece of her past she had not shared. It sat between her and Jonah, a silent, invisible wall. He had defended her in public, stood by her side against rumor and threat, and had asked for nothing in return. He had accepted her as Eliza Hart, the determined homesteader. What would he think when he learned she was also Eliza Langley, the runaway heiress? He was a man who valued things that were straight and true, like a well-planed board. Her entire presence in Ash Bluff was built on a foundation of omission. She feared that when he knew the full truth, he would see her not as resilient, but as deceitful. Just another wealthy Easterner playing games with the lives of hard-working people. The thought was a cold knot in her stomach, heavier than any stone she had lifted. The day before the judge was due to arrive, they worked until the last light failed, hurrying to finish the sheathing on the roof. The air was cold and still. When the work was done, they stood for a moment, looking at the solid shape of the house, now almost fully enclosed. It looked like a real home. They built a fire inside, on the packed earth where a hearth would one day stand. The flames pushed back the deep shadows, painting the new wood of the walls and rafters in flickering shades of orange and gold. The smell of burning pine filled the small, warm space. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence stretching between them, no longer comfortable but filled with unspoken things. Eliza knew she could not wait any longer. She could not stand before a judge, before the entire town, with this lie still between her and the one person who had believed in her. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She said, "Jonah, there is something I must tell you. My name, it is not the only one I have." He looked at her across the flames, his light eyes unblinking. Patient? He waited. Her voice was low, the words coming out in a rush she could not control. She said, "Back east. My family's name is Langley. We were in the textile business. We are very wealthy. I left because I could not bear that life. The deals made in back rooms. The way money was used as a weapon. I took a portion of what was mine, enough to start a new life. And I came here. I called myself Hart because I wanted to be a new person. Someone defined by what I did, not by the name I was born with. I never meant to deceive anyone. I just wanted to be free." She finally ran out of words, her confession hanging in the firelit air. She looked at him, her heart pounding, expecting to see disappointment, suspicion, even anger in his face. She had laid her greatest vulnerability bare, and she was terrified of his judgment. Jonah did not speak. He did not move. He simply watched her, his expression unchanged. The only sound was the crackle and hiss of the fire. An eternity seemed to pass in the space of 10 slow breaths. She could feel his silence as a physical weight. He was measuring her words, weighing them against the weeks of shared labor, the dust storms, the cold nights. When he finally spoke, his voice was as quiet and steady as ever. He looked at her, then at her hands, which were resting on her knees. They were no longer the hands of an heiress. They were scraped and calloused, the nails broken, the palms stained with the pitch of the wood. He said, "Your name can change. The way you hold a hammer cannot." The words were so simple, so practical, so completely him. They were not words of forgiveness, for he saw nothing that needed forgiving. They were words of acceptance, an acceptance so total and unconditional it brought tears to her eyes. He had not judged her by her past, by her family, by her money. He had judged her by the evidence of his own eyes, by the work they had done together, side by side. He had dismissed a lifetime of secrets with a simple observation about a tool. The cold knot of fear in her stomach dissolved, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. A tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. Before she could wipe it away, he had moved. He was kneeling in front of her, his one hand coming up to gently cup her face. His thumb brushed the tear from her skin, his touch surprisingly gentle for a hand so strong and calloused. He looked into her eyes, and in their clear, light depths, she saw not pity, but a profound and quiet understanding. And then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was short and warm and as honest as he was. It tasted of wood smoke and coffee and the cold, clean air of the mountains. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, a confirmation of the trust that had grown between them in the silent language of shared work. It was enough. When he pulled back, the awkwardness that might have followed was broken by the ghost of a smile on his face. He said, "Just make sure the coffee tomorrow is a little less bitter." She laughed, a real, unrestrained laugh of pure relief. The dark night of her soul had passed. The dawn was not yet here, but for the first time, she could see the hope of its light on the horizon. The next morning, they did not go to the claim. Instead, they met at the blacksmith's forge, which had become their unofficial headquarters. Nell was already there, her face set with a determined look, and Mr. O'Rourke was stoking the fire, the muscles in his great arms flexing. The fear of the previous night had been replaced by a focused resolve. They had one day to prepare their defense. Eliza finally retrieved the heavy, wax-sealed folder from the safe at the post office. She spread the contents out on Mr. O'Rourke's massive anvil, the clean, crisp legal documents looking strange and out of place in the smoky forge. They had her proof of identity, her financial statements, everything they needed to prove she was who she said she was and that she could afford the land. But Nell shook her head. She said, "This proves you are not a fraud, Eliza, but it does not prove that Silas is. The judge will see this as a private dispute. Your word against his. We need more. We need to find a place where he broke the law." And so their work began. They transformed the forge into a war room. Nell brought ledgers from the post office and the county clerk's office records that Peters, the nervous clerk, had reluctantly handed over when faced with a direct request from a federal employee, Mr. O'Rourke, who had served on the town council years before, remembered the bylaws and regulations that governed land auctions. They spent hours poring over the dry, dusty records, searching for a crack in the banker's armor. They mapped out the timeline of events, from the day of the fire to the posting of the notice. They were looking for a mistake, a single procedural error that would invalidate the entire process Silas had set in motion. It was late in the afternoon when Nell finally found it. Her finger traced a line across a page in the clerk's logbook. She looked up, her eyes bright with triumph. She said, "I have got him." According to county law, a notice of a tax auction had to be publicly posted for a minimum of 30 consecutive days before the sale could take place. Nell pointed to the entry in the log. The notice for the Carver claim had been posted on a Tuesday, but the official record of payment to the regional newspaper, a payment handled by the bank of Silas Drake, was dated for the Friday of that same week. For 3 days, the notice had been up illegally, before the legally required advertisement had even been paid for. It was a small detail, a matter of a few days. But in the rigid world of the law, it was a fatal flaw. Silas, in his haste to push the auction through, had cut a corner. Eliza felt a surge of hope. It was not just her word against his anymore. It was his own sloppy paperwork, his own greed. That would be his undoing. As the sun began to set, they gathered their evidence. Nell carefully copied the relevant entries from the ledgers. Mr. O'Rourke, in his surprisingly neat hand, wrote out a statement citing the county bylaw. Eliza looked at the papers spread out on the anvil, the foundation of her legal fight. But her mind was on the house, on the wood and stone that represented her real purpose. She turned to O'Rourke and asked for a piece of scrap wood, a smooth plank of pine, with a piece of charcoal. She began to sketch. It was not a legal document. It was a drawing of the finished house, and next to it, a smaller building, with a simple sign over the door that read Ash Bluff School. She outlined where the desks would go, where the blackboard would hang. She looked at Jonah, who had been watching her, a quiet approval in his eyes. She said, "This is what this is about. It is not about getting revenge on Silas Drake. It is not about proving I am right. It is about this, building a home, building a school. That is all I want." Jonah picked up another piece of charcoal. On the same board, below her drawing, he began to sketch out the measurements for the school's foundation, the list of materials they would need. The legal papers sat to one side, a necessary tool. But on the board, carved in charcoal on pine, was the promise of the future. It was a blueprint for a life, a contract written not in ink, but in the shared language of builders. The circuit judge, a man named Hargrove with a face like carved granite and eyes that had seen every form of human folly, did not convene his court in the saloon. He chose the town hall, a plain, drafty building that served as a church on Sundays, lending the proceedings a solemnity that the saloon, with its ghosts of whiskey and regret, could never provide. The room was packed, the benches filled with the same faces from the meeting, but the mood was different. The nervous energy had been replaced by a quiet, anxious anticipation. This was not a forum for opinions. It was a place of binding decisions. Eliza sat beside Jonah on the front bench. He was a silent, solid presence at her side. Across the aisle sat Silas Drake, and next to him, a hired lawyer from Denver, a man with a tailored suit and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Ambrose Vale sat just behind them, his notebook open, his pen poised like a vulture's beak. Judge Hargrove began with a voice that tolerated no nonsense. He reviewed the petition from Silas Drake and then fixed his gaze on the Denver lawyer. He said, "You have made a serious accusation of fraud. Counselor, present your evidence." The lawyer rose, his movements smooth and practiced. He did not have evidence. He had a story. He spun a tale of a vulnerable, grieving town and a mysterious woman who had appeared out of nowhere, using a false name. He spoke of her refusal of assistance from the town's most prominent citizen, Mr. Drake. He questioned her motives, her character, her very identity. He turned dramatically and pointed a finger at Eliza. He asked, "Who is Eliza Hart? Is she a simple mail-order bride? Or is she an agent for powerful Eastern interests, sent here under an assumed name to deceive this community? We do not know. And until we do, this court has a duty to protect the assets of the late Miles Carver and the integrity of this town." The judge listened, his face impassive. When the lawyer finished, Hargrove looked at Eliza. He said, "Miss Hart, the counselor raises a point. The name you use is not the name you were given at birth. Explain yourself." Eliza stood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She held the small envelope from the town meeting. She looked directly at the judge, her voice clear and unwavering. She said, "Your Honor, it is true. I was born Eliza Langley. It is also true that I legally and formally changed my name to Eliza Hart. In a court of law in Philadelphia, a certified copy of that order is in this envelope. My reasons were personal. The life of a Langley was not a life I wanted to lead. My purpose in coming to Ash Bluff was exactly as I stated, to marry Mr. Carver and build a life here. My purpose has not changed, though my circumstances have. My purpose is to build a home, purchase this land legally, and contribute to this community by establishing a school. My purpose is not, and has never been, to deceive anyone." She placed the envelope on the witness stand. The judge reviewed the document, his expression unreadable. The lawyer for Silas scoffed. Saying a name change does not erase a history of deception. Judge Hargrove's gaze sharpened. He asked, "Do you have any evidence of deception?" "Counselor, any proof of a single fraudulent act committed by this woman since her arrival in Ash Bluff?" The lawyer stammered, saying her very presence under a false name was evidence enough. The judge's lip curled in a sneer. He said, "In this country, a person's name is their own business. So long as it is not used to commit a crime, you have shown me no crime. You have only shown me your own suspicions." He seemed ready to dismiss the case when Nell stepped forward. She said, "Your Honor, if I may, there is the matter of the auction itself." All eyes turned to the postmistress. She carried the clerk's official logbook. She explained calmly and clearly the county bylaw regarding the 30-day public notice requirement. She opened the logbook and presented it to the judge, her finger pointing to 2 separate entries. She said, "As you can see, Your Honor, the notice for the auction was posted in this town on Tuesday, the 10th of last month. But the record of payment to the newspaper, the official start of the legal notification period, is dated Friday, the 13th. For 3 days. That notice was posted illegally. The entire auction process is therefore invalid." A gasp went through the room. The judge's eyes narrowed as he examined the logbook. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the crowd until it landed on the county clerk, Peters, who seemed to be trying to shrink into the wall. The judge's voice was like the crack of a whip. He asked Mr. Peters to approach the bench. The clerk stumbled forward, his face slick with sweat. The judge pointed to the logbook. He asked if that was his handwriting. Peters nodded, unable to speak. The judge asked why there was a discrepancy. Peters began to stammer, his eyes darting toward Silas Drake. He mumbled something about a clerical error, a simple mistake. The judge leaned forward. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. He said, I have seen many things in my courtroom, Mr. Peters. A simple mistake is not one of them. Under penalty of perjury, you will tell me if you were instructed to post that notice early." The clerk broke. A choked sob escaped his lips. He confessed everything, his words tumbling out in a pathetic rush. He spoke of his debts, of the pressure from Mr. Drake, of the promise that it was just a small bending of the rules to expedite the process. The courtroom erupted. Silas Drake was on his feet, his face purple with rage, shouting that the clerk was a liar. The Denver lawyer was trying to restrain him. Judge Hargrove's gavel crashed down again and again, the sound echoing like thunder. When silence was restored, his eyes were chips of ice. He looked at Silas Drake with a look of utter contempt. He dismissed the petition against Eliza Hart with prejudice. He officially recognized her legal standing and her right to participate in any future and properly conducted auction for the property. He then turned his fury on Silas and his lawyer. He warned them that if they brought another such frivolous and malicious suit before his court, he would see them both sanctioned for abuse of the legal process. "The law," he finished, his voice ringing through the hall, "is a shield for the innocent, not a cudgel for the greedy. This court is adjourned." It was a total, stunning victory, as Eliza, Jonah, Nell, and Mr. O'Rourke stepped out of the town hall into the afternoon light. They were surrounded by a crowd of townspeople, their faces now open and friendly, their hands outstretched in congratulation. The old cowboy who had complimented her hammering slapped Jonah on the back, declaring it was a good day for honest work. But as they stood there, blinking in the sudden sunlight, a shadow fell over them. The brilliant blue sky had vanished. In the west, a wall of clouds, the color of a fresh bruise, was boiling up over the mountains. The air grew heavy and cold. The wind, which had been a constant whisper for weeks, died completely, leaving a silent, suffocating stillness. The first drop of rain was not a drop. It was a heavy splat that left a dark circle the size of a silver dollar in the dust. Then another, and another, and then the sky opened. It was a deluge, a vertical river falling from the heavens. The rain was so thick it was hard to breathe, so loud on the tin roofs of the town that people had to shout to be heard. A new sound joined the roar of the rain, a low guttural rumble that seemed to be coming from the earth itself. It was the sound of the dry creek bed, the one that ran just below the Hart claim, coming to life. A flash flood, all the rain falling on the hard, dry hills was funneling into that one narrow channel, turning it from a dusty ditch into a raging, muddy torrent. Someone shouted, "The house." Eliza's heart stopped. Their house, her house, stood directly in the path of the rising water. She began to run, heedless of the mud and the blinding rain. Jonah was right beside her, behind them. The entire town seemed to be running, their legal victory forgotten in the face of a more immediate, elemental threat. When they reached the claim, the sight was terrifying. The creek was a brown, churning monster, already overflowing its banks, carrying rocks and whole trees in its current. The water was rising with incredible speed, swirling around the stone foundation of the house. There was no time for a plan. They acted on pure instinct. Jonah grabbed the coils of rope they had used in the sandstorm. With Mr. O'Rourke and the other men, he began to secure the main frame of the house, tying one end to the strongest beams and the other to the deep-rooted cottonwood trees on the higher ground. He moved with a desperate, focused energy, his one hand a blur of motion as he tied knots that would not slip. Eliza saw that the ropes would not be enough. The water was undermining the foundation itself, washing away the earth that supported the stones. She grabbed a shovel, and without a thought for her own safety, she plunged into the knee-deep, freezing water at the edge of the flood. She began to dig, her movements frantic, trying to carve a new channel, a trench to divert even a small part of the torrent away from the house. Others joined her, a line of men and women with shovels, picks, anything they could find. fighting a desperate battle against the rising river. They worked in a frenzy of shared purpose. The divisions and suspicions of the town washed away in the muddy water. The flood peaked. A massive log, torn from the high country, came careening down the current and slammed into the corner of the house. The entire structure groaned, shifting on its foundation with a sound of tearing wood. A main support beam, the one holding the central weight of the new roof, began to give way. Jonah was on the frame itself, trying to brace the beam, his boots slipping on the wet, treacherous wood. The beam shifted again, and he lost his footing. He fell, his body swinging out over the raging water, his only hold the leather harness on his shoulder, which had snagged on a protruding nail. Eliza screamed his name. Without thinking, she dropped her shovel and scrambled onto the foundation, her hands finding purchase on the slick wood. She reached him just as the nail began to pull free. She did not grab his arm. She grabbed the wide leather strap of his harness, the symbol of his strength and his resilience. She dug her fingers in, her entire body straining, the muscles in her back and shoulders screaming in protest. He looked up at her, his face pale, the roar of the water all around them. She held his gaze, her own face set with a fierce, unwavering determination. She shouted over the storm, her words a raw cry from the heart. "I do not abandon the man who is building it." With a surge of strength she did not know she possessed, she pulled Mr. O'Rourke was there, his massive hands grabbing Jonah's belt, and together they hauled him back onto the safety of the frame. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the rain lessened. The roar of the flood began to subside. The water, having crested, began to recede, leaving behind a thick blanket of mud and debris. The house, battered and scarred but miraculously whole, was still standing. A ragged, exhausted cheer went up from the crowd of townspeople. They were covered in mud, soaked to the bone, but they were triumphant. They had faced the court, and they had faced the flood, and they had won. People clapped Jonah on the back, their faces filled with respect. The women, their earlier suspicions forgotten, crowded around Eliza, hugging her, their shared struggle creating a bond stronger than any gossip. As the last of the rain turned to a fine mist, Jonah walked to the center of the house. He found the storm lantern, which had been knocked to the ground but was miraculously unbroken. He lit it, its flame a small, steady point of gold in the gray, wet twilight. He did not hang it on the low beam where it had been before. He climbed onto a brace, reached up, and hung it from the highest point of the roof. The very beam they had almost lost. Its light shone out over the ravaged land. A small, defiant beacon, a promise of a home that had been tested by law and by nature, and had refused to be broken. The dawn that broke over Ash Bluff after the flood was unlike any that had come before. It was a world washed clean, baptized in mud and rainwater. The air, stripped of its dust, was so clear the distant, snow-dusted peaks of the San Juan Mountains seemed close enough to touch. The aftermath of the legal and natural storms was a quiet, shared exhaustion, and something more, a profound and settled sense of peace. The first casualty of the new era was the power of Silas Drake, his defeat in the courtroom, followed by the town's unified stand against the flood, had shattered his authority. He was no longer the respectable banker, the town patriarch. He was just a greedy man who had been exposed. Word came down from the county seat that an official investigation into his banking practices and his abuse of the clerk's office was underway. He did not wait for the results. One morning, his fine horse and buggy were simply gone. His bank office shuttered, his presence in the town evaporating like a puddle in the morning sun. Ambrose Vale had vanished with him, his leather notebook filled with a story of failure he would likely never write. Their departure was not celebrated. It was barely noted. The town had already moved on. The focus of Ash Bluff was now singular. It was the house on the hill, the day after the flood. A procession of townspeople made its way up the muddy track to the Hart claim, not as curious onlookers, but as a determined workforce. Mr. O'Rourke arrived with a wagon load of shingles he had bartered for. The mothers whose children Eliza had read to came with baskets of bread, dried meat, and hot coffee. This time brewed to be sustaining, not merely strong. The ranchers and farmers, men of few words, came with their tools and their quiet competence. The work of finishing the house became a communal act, a barn raising in slow motion. It was a celebration of what they had saved together. Jonah was no longer just a hired carpenter. He was the undisputed architect and foreman, his quiet authority absolute. He moved through the work site, his one hand directing, correcting, and building with an efficiency that was a constant source of wonder. He took the time to show Mr. O'Rourke's eldest son how to properly balance a hammer, how to read the grain of a plank before making a cut. The boy, who had once been a leader of the rock-throwing pack, now watched Jonah with a look of pure reverence. Eliza, her shoulder a tapestry of purple and blue, found her role as well. She was the organizer, the planner, the steady heart of the project. She worked alongside the other women, preparing meals, treating cuts and scrapes, and keeping a meticulous account of the supplies. One afternoon, she took a bucket of white paint she had purchased from the general store and a fine brush. On a smooth, wide plank of pine that Jonah had planed for her, she carefully painted the words, Ash Bluff School. Her letters were not as ornate as the script in the Eastern books she owned, but they were clear, straight, and strong. They were the letters of a builder. The day the last shingle was nailed to the roof, a cheer went up that echoed off the mountains. The house was done. It stood proud and solid on its stone foundation, the fresh spruce wood glowing in the autumn sun. It was not a grand house, but it was sturdy, honest, and it belonged. The first day of school was held 2 weeks later. The main room of the house, still smelling of sawdust and fresh paint, was filled with makeshift desks Jonah had built from scrap lumber. Nearly every child in Ash Bluff was there, their faces scrubbed, their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. But the students were not all children. In the back row sat 3 old ranchers, their hats held respectfully in their laps. They were men who had lived their entire lives by the strength of their backs and the shrewdness of their eyes, but who had always had to make their mark with an X on legal documents, leaving them vulnerable to the fine print of men like Silas Drake. Eliza started her first lesson not with the alphabet for the children, but by teaching these old, proud men how to sign their own names. She told the children stories, not just of pirates and treasure, but of the world she had left behind. She spoke of the great, clattering textile mills, not as places of magic, but as places of hard work, of opportunities and dangers. She explained how a bank worked, how interest was calculated, how a contract should be read. She gave them the truth, stripping away the myths of the East, giving them practical knowledge, tools they could use to build their own lives. Life settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. The bitterness that had defined her arrival had been washed away, leaving a rich soil of community and shared purpose. Her days were filled with the challenges of teaching and the simple joys of making a home. The coffee she brewed for Jonah each morning became a running joke between them. It had improved, but it was still, by his estimation, strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe. One crisp morning, as he took a sip from the tin mug she offered him, he made a great show of wincing. He said, "It is better, but still bitter enough to make a man remember his troubles." Eliza laughed, the sound easy and familiar in the morning air. She took the mug from his hand, took a sip herself, and looked him in the eye, a playful challenge in her gaze. She said, "If you want to be sure of a sweet cup of coffee for the rest of your life, you know what you have to do." Jonah just looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. A group of children, arriving early for school, heard a remark and broke into a fit of giggles. The proposal was not a question, but a challenge. issued in the open, under the bright morning sun, with the next generation as their witnesses. That evening, after the children had gone home and the sun was beginning its slow descent, Jonah asked her to walk with him. He did not lead her to the house, but to the old, scarred cottonwood tree at the edge of the claim. The wound from the storm was visible, a pale slash against the dark bark, but from the branches above, a thick crown of new leaves had sprouted, their edges tipped with the gold of autumn. He stopped beneath the tree and turned to face her. He did not have a fancy speech prepared. He was a man of wood and steel, not of empty words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a ring, a simple band of silver, hammered into shape, its surface not perfectly smooth but bearing the honest marks of the forge. She could see the hand of Mr. O'Rourke in its simple, powerful beauty. Jonah took her hand, his calloused palm warm and gentle against hers. He looked at her, his light eyes serious and full of a quiet, profound emotion. He said, "Eliza, I only have one hand to offer you, but I have a whole life to build with. You have two good hands. Do you think that is enough for us to make a roof over our heads?" Her heart was too full to speak. She thought of her arrival in this place, a stranger with a secret and a trunk full of ashes. She had come looking for a home and had found something infinitely more valuable. She had found a man who had seen her true worth, not in her name or her money, but in the strength of her hands and the courage of her heart. She met his gaze, her own eyes shining. She said, "I came here with a secret in ash, and I found a carpenter who was worth more. Yes, Jonah, 1,000 times. Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, and then he kissed her, a long, sweet kiss under the branches of the healing tree, a promise of a future as solid and true as the mountains that stood witness around them. From the porch of the new house, a cheer went up. The children had been watching. The next day, Mr. O'Rourke took the old, cracked horseshoe, the one Eliza had found in the ashes on her first day. He heated it in the glowing heart of his forge, the place where the town's strength was shaped. He did not try to mend the crack. He hammered the iron straight, reforming it, transforming the symbol of broken luck into something new. He shaped it into a small, handsome plaque. Later, Jonah hung it on the front door of their new home, a home that was now theirs together. On its surface, Eliza had painted 5 simple words, a truth they had learned in the heart of the fire, the storm, and the flood cracks let the light in. The first snows of winter would soon arrive, promising a season of hardship and cold. But inside the house on the hill, a fire would be burning in the hearth. A school would be filled with the sounds of learning and laughter, and from the highest rafter, a single storm lantern would shine its steady, hopeful light out into the darkness, a beacon for a home, a school, and a community that had been built, not from perfection, but from the ashes. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of the Old West. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from. Subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners around the world.